Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Power Chord Productions and Podcastings. I am your host, John Harrington, back to hit you with another video, and today we are going to be getting into something that you guys have been waiting for a while now, and it has taken some time for me to get this video out, but we are now getting into the final part in the What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero series, The Princess and the Spider, the movie No Way Home. Now, for those of you who have been following this series from the very beginning, we have been doing What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, essentially the Spider-Man from the MCU, the Tom Holland Spider-Man, during the events of Infinity War. Instead of being dusted away, in the events of the snap, is instead isekai to the world of ReZero, and basically takes the place of Subaru Natsuki and goes on the various adventures. He eventually made his return during the events of Endgame, but instead was the one that performed the snap, thus saving his world, but dying in the process. But thanks to Return by Death, he was able to return back to the world of ReZero, where the story continued on into Season 2 up until its end. But the multiverse is something of which we know frighteningly little. In an alternate world where a world similar to the MCU, but things played out a little differently. But the more things changed, the more things stayed the same. And by chance, Peter, along with Rem and Beatrice, they've now found themselves back in Peter's world, in the middle of New York. But this world isn't quite the one that Peter left. There's another Spider-Man, and apparently he's wanted. But not just that. Villains from Spider-Man's past, from all major movie franchises, all converge in this What If special. But not just villains from the movie past. Some from ReZero will be coming back as well. But what roles will they play in this movie? How will things turn for Peter? Will he, Rem, and Beatrice find their way back home? What will be the fate of the Spider-Man legacy? All this and more as we get into today's featured presentation of What If Spider-Man Was in ReZero, The Princess and the Spider, the movie No Way Home. As always, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It all happened so fast. 1 minute, they were in Roswald's mansion. Peter, Beatrice, Rem, Rom, Amelia, Subaru, all of them enjoying a good time. The next thing he knew, he was back. Peter looked around and he saw Beatrice and Rem were beside him. He looked to see that he was back in New York. In Times Square, no less. He looked at his clothing and he recognized it as his old uniform. The suit he first used as Spider-Man before Mr. Stark gave him his first suit. As he looked around, the crowd, they started to notice him, but they were too focused on the screen high above them. Peter, Beatrice, and Rem looked up to see that there was a man by the name of J. Jonah Jameson delivering some breaking news. Apparently there was some hero named Mysterio, some warrior from another dimension who died tragically in some fight in London, and that apparently he had been killed by Spider-Man? Both Rem and Beatrice looked at Peter a bit concerned, as they didn't know that he had killed someone by some chance, or a hero. And Peter tried to explain that it wasn't him, and when they looked up, it wasn't him. J. Jonah Jameson revealed the identity of Spider-Man, left from a voice message from Mysterio, and the young man's name, well, it wasn't Peter Parker. It was a kid named Miles Morales. As he continued on looking further at the screen, he would see that this kid named Miles Morales was apparently besmirching the good name of the previous Spider-Man that had come before him. And then, as the screen changed once again, Peter would recognize that the next face, well, it was his. It was a much older version of him, granted. A beard, a few wrinkles, but he couldn't deny the fact that that was definitely him. And he apparently died, saving the world against the Mad Titan Thanos. It sounded similar to what had happened to him the last time he had been called back to his world, when the snap had been undone the first time, but this wasn't like before. While all this was going on, Peter would see something swinging high above in the distance. It was something in a flash of red and black, and Peter would grab onto Rem and Beatrice immediately, before slinging on his mask and web swinging into the air also. The people looked and saw what had happened, and they couldn't believe what they were seeing either. They knew they had just saw Spider-Man, but there was another person swinging just like Spider-Man, and his suit looked very similar to the first. As Peter went swinging with Beatrice and Rem, the two of them were very confused about where they were. This wasn't Lagunica. This wasn't like any world they had ever seen. Beatrice was confused but fascinated. Rem was a bit fearful, as she had never seen something like a car or a TV screen. She wondered what type of strange magic this was. Peter, while web swinging, holding the both of them, tried his best to explain that this was the world that he had come from, and that everything they were seeing wasn't really magic, although magic did exist here to an extent. As he continued web swinging, he would hear the muttering of this other Spider-Man swinging in front of him, and Peter called out for him immediately. "Hey kid, hold up!" "Huh? What the hell?" The first Spider-Man would stop, seeing this other with these two strange-looking people beside him. Some blue-haired maid girl and some little blonde. Who are you? Why are you dressed like that? Where did you get that suit? Hold up. First off, I should be the one asking you some questions. How are you Spider-Man? You're not Peter Parker. No shit, I'm not Peter Parker. As you know, my name's Miles Morales. And who are you? Peter would take off his mask and reveal himself. I'm Peter Parker. No way. Why are you looking at me like that? You've seen a ghost. Because you are a ghost. No, I'm not. I'm Peter. No, you're not. First off, Peter was a lot older when he died, and even if it was you, where have you been this whole time? Where have I been? I don't even know what's going on here. I'm not, you're not what? Look, just calm down, okay? I promise you, I am Peter Parker, but Peter's dead. He died a while ago. I figured as much. You want to explain to me what happened? How are you Spider-Man? You really don't know? No, I don't. So tell me. Peter? Yeah, Rem? What's that? Everyone turned to see multiple helicopters circling around them. It seemed as though the news cameras had caught up to them quicker than they were expecting. Peter told him there was no time to explain, and he threw on his mask as quickly as possible. Beatrice didn't feel like web swinging anymore as it messed up her hair and made her a little bit dizzy, but there was no time to complain. Peter and Miles instantly knowing that they needed to get away. For Peter, even if this was a different universe, this was the same old New York. He knew the alleys and the back ways and knew where to swing to. Telling Miles to follow him, they would eventually go to a secluded area that Peter knew about, a place where hopefully no cameras would appear. Once they were there and everyone was catching their breath, making sure they weren't followed, Peter and Miles once again would continue their conversation. And Peter would tell him to explain everything that happened in this universe. Miles took a deep breath, and his story began as such. In this universe, a universe very similar to the MCU that you, the listener, are familiar with, this version of Peter Parker, as we will refer to as the Tom Parker, was a lot older. There's no real reason or explanation behind this. Some believe that in this universe, Peter Parker was born sometime earlier than before, meaning he was a lot older when the start of the MCU began, and when he became Spider-Man. Being much older, he was a lot more independent than the Peter Parker you've been familiar with. And as such, he continued on as Spider-Man well into his young adult and adult years. By the time Civil War began, Peter Parker, instead of being a freshly made 16-year-old, was actually 26 around the time when Iron Man came to him asking for his help during the events of Captain America Civil War. This Spider-Man, being a lot older and a lot more seasoned and mature, didn't take to following Iron Man so blindly, and was easily able to deduce and make his own way for himself. For whatever reason, during the events of Civil War, Iron Man unfortunately was assassinated during the events of that story arc, and Captain America would go on to hunt down Tony's killer, and eventually killed him himself. Without Iron Man, there seemed to be a bit of a void for some time, a void that needed to be filled. Between the events of Civil War and Infinity War, Miles Morales would miraculously gain his ability as a Spider-Man in this universe. Once he gained his powers, Peter, becoming aware of who Miles was, took it upon himself to train the young man, to use his Spire-like abilities, and to be the best hero that he could be. You could say that in this universe, Peter essentially became Tony, and Miles became Peter. The events of Infinity War and Endgame would play out much similar to how they did in our world. However, with the added note that Peter basically took the Iron Man approach when it came to things, basically serving as a bit of the forefront when it came to science and other technologies. He was one of the few heroes that wasn't snapped away. However, Miles was in the process. And wanting to bring back his young friend, as well as those who had perished, Peter would eventually help the other Avengers go through with the time heist, eventually gaining back the Infinity Stones and reversing the snap. During the events of the final battle, this older, more experienced version of Peter Parker would perform the snap that would send away Thanos and his entire army, although in the process, he himself would die. Following the death of Peter Parker in this universe, Miles Morales effectively became the only Spider-Man. This Miles had gone through his own fair share of hardships during his time. His father, a diligent police officer, tragically lost his life in the line of duty as a result of the machinations of the one known as Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, who had become a known rival to the Spider-Man. The Kingpin and his influence had caused much harm for Peter in his life, not just with the death of his father, but later on with the death of his late uncle, Aaron Davis, also known as the Prowler. Hearing this, our Peter would become a bit disheartened. He remembered meeting an Aaron Davis back in his own world. It was back when he was first starting out, working under Tony, and when he had first gotten this new suit, he remembered stopping him, trying to get some information, and leaving him web-tied to his car for some time. He seemed much younger back then. To think that so much time had passed, well, that was a lot to be explained. Miles would continue on with the story. After the death of Peter, Miles would be contacted by his late family. This Peter Parker didn't die alone. In fact, he had a wife and child. He was survived by his wife, Michelle Jones, or MJ Parker, and their daughter, Mayday Parker, as well as his Aunt May. There was also the family Fred, Ned Leeds, who would help in any way that he could. Similar to how he assisted Peter Parker during his adventures as Spider-Man, Ned took to assisting Miles in any way that he could also. Following the death of Peter Parker, the Parker family would become aware of Miles Morales. They had always known about him since Peter had told them of him from time to time, and after his death, they felt the need to watch over him and help him in a way, like how they helped and worked with Peter in the past. Upon doing so, the Parker family became Peter's family in a sense, and they helped him as he took over as the only Spider-Man protecting New York. Eventually, Miles would go on a class trip to Europe, most notably a few key spots, including London, England. It was during this time that he met others in the hero community, among the few that he had met during the events of Infinity War and Endgame. He met a guy named Nick Fury, and another guy who claimed to be from another universe. His name was Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio. However, it soon became learned that this elemental fighting hero from the alternate dimension proved to be nothing but a class act faker and a liar. He used complicated holograms and drones to create fake disasters to appear as being one of the elite heroes. It had become apparent that Quentin Beck actually had a history of crime, and that effectively he was one of Spider-Man's oldest enemies, although he went under many aliases before finally settling on Mysterio. He believed that after his Spider-Man's death, Peter Parker, that he would finally be able to take over. He felt that this was a chance to start anew, but he needed a convincing way of doing so. And as such, he created Mysterio. Unfortunately, his plans came to a bit of an end when he ran into Miles in London. And with some help from Ned and the others, well, he was eventually defeated. However, in his dying words, Quentin made Miles' life a living nightmare, exposing his identity to the world and blaming him for the London attacks. His life had been screwed and turned upside down, and to make matters worse, this blogger, some old guy called J. Jonah Jameson, running this channel called the Daily Bugle, he wasn't too fond of the new Spider-Man. Not that he was ever fond of the old one either, but the old one at least proved him wrong and proved to be a hero that saved the entire universe, whereas with Miles, well, he thought that he was just a fake who could never live up to the shoes of the original. And things only got from bad to worse, as a lot of Miles' enemies now knew who he was. Among them, the Kingpin. He sent various villains and other assassins after him on a daily basis, his mother even being caught in the crosshairs a few times. All the same though, his family life had become a lot more complicated than he was expecting, and for a brief time he was facing jail. Although thankfully they were able to find him a good lawyer, some guy named Matt Murdock. But all the same, Miles's life was totally turned upside down. Ultimately, Miles went to Doctor Strange for help, believing that someone of the mystic arts should be capable of helping him reverse the situation, making everyone forget that he was Spider-Man. Although they tried to perform the spell, it was a bit more complicated and they didn't know if it had worked or not. Doctor Strange contained something, but he wasn't sure of what it was, and he told Miles that he would look into trying to fix it as soon as possible, but in the meantime for him to keep a low profile. As he did so, well, Miles, he just went about his normal life. He was web swinging through the city, and that's when this young Peter showed up. This now left Peter with a lot more than what he was wondering. For Beatrice, she was able to follow along pretty well, and she was actually more interested in this Doctor Strange, someone of another universe who dwelled in the mystic arts. Well, that was something that piqued her interest. For Rem, well, she was just absolutely mesmerized. She had heard stories from Peter talking about the world he had come from, about his escapades as Spider-Man, but to hear them all confirmed, to learn of his battles against these nearly impossible odds and these great enemies, to learn that he had saved the whole universe, it only made her admiration and her love for him grow even higher. But Peter had other concerns at the moment. This world was definitely the most similar to the world that he had come from. The last thing that he had remembered was he was in his fight with Thanos. Instead of letting Iron Man perform the snap, he did so himself, not only to save the world that he had originally come from, but using Return by Death, he was able to make his way back to Lagunica. He never thought that he would find himself back in this old world, and he had been, but this wasn't necessarily his world. If anything, it was a variant of his world, but it wasn't the one that he originally came from. All the same, they knew that there was no point in standing around here. But he would look to Rem and Beatrice, and he promised them he was going to find a way back home. Although he wasn't sure of how. Return by Death could be an option, but there was always the possibility of not knowing how Return by Death worked. Peter wasn't fond of just spamming that ability. He hated it. He was still trying to figure out a way to get back at Satella, the Witch of Envy. But he had no way of knowing how. And what if in a cruel twist of fate, what if he died and made his way back home, but that was just a different reality, and he left a version of Rem and Beatrice stuck here? He didn't want to put them through that. Knowing that he didn't have much of a choice, he had to figure out for a way to get them all back home. Beatrice would ask more about this Doctor Strange, and Peter would remember that he knew Doctor Strange, well, a version of him anyway. If there was anyone who could figure out anything, then it had to be him. Miles would agree, and the four would set out to go find Doctor Strange immediately. The group deciding that if there was anyone who could help them, it would have to be this world's best sorcerer. Partnered with a skilled magic user in Beatrice, Peter believed that they could definitely figure out something. The group would decide to first head to the Parker home, thinking that they had to catch them up to speed on everything that was happening also. They had moved in the recent couple of months, and Aunt May had bought a house for herself where she lived, along with MJ and with Mayday, the three Parker women, and Ned would visit them from time to time since he lived in his own apartment. They would go web swinging as they made their way to a bridge, but as they were swinging by, their spider sense would go off immediately. Peter would stop everyone, and Miles would stop also. He asked Miles if he had the tingle, and Miles would look at him confused, wondering if he was referring to his spider sense, and yeah, he had it, and he sensed what was coming. They felt the ground begin to shake and rumble underground. They weren't sure of what was coming next, but Peter and Miles donned on their masks. Rem stood back and took out her wrecking mace immediately, and Beatrice could also sense that a threat was coming as well, but she chose not to get involved since it wasn't something that required her expertise. Mechanical arms would start to shoot through the bridge, Peter and Miles getting ready as explosions would occur next to them. The ground would begin to tear and shake before eventually 4 robotic limbs would appear. A man in a dark trench coat with glasses would lower himself as he faced the 2 Spider-Mans. "Hello, Peter." "Who are you?" "Playing dumb, huh? Well, that's not going to get you very far, and..." "Who is this? So there's 2 of you? No matter. You'll all fall just the same." The man with the mechanical arms would attack the 2 Spider-Men immediately. Miles and Peter both dodging and moving in sync and in coordination. This 4-limbed mechanical foe, or whoever he was, seemed to be very intimate with the 2, as if he knew who they were, or at least he thought he did. Peter would then demonstrate the difference between him and Miles. This Peter had been spending his time in Lagunica. He had learned to channel his own inner magics, and he was a step above what this enemy was expecting. Otto Octavius, otherwise known as Doc Ock, would be caught off guard as Peter started to propel himself up in the air. Peter using his wind magic, channeling his mana through his own gate. He didn't need to web swing unnecessarily, allowing him to pick his targets. He would shoot his webs at various parts of the mechanical limbs, binding and holding them in place, and Miles would take a chance to show what he could do. Peter would be shocked when Miles would perform the Venom Touch, displaying an electrical charge from his fingertips, shocking Otto and stunning him to the ground. Peter didn't even know that another Spider-Man could do that. "Hey, when did you get electrical powers?" "What do you mean? When did you learn how to use wind?" I learned magic." "Are you serious? Who taught you?" A spirit cat?" "Okay. But how did you get electrical powers? Did you learn magic also?" No. It just came with the spider bite." "What did you get?" Wall crawling, the sense, strength. That's about it." "I see. Well, can you do this?" Miles would use his camouflage and turn invisible instantly. Now Peter just felt even more jealous. Although, now that he thought about it, he did come from a world where magic existed. There had to be some sort of invisibility spell. Maybe he could learn it sometime. In the meantime, the 2 Spider-Mans would continue their fight with this Doc Ock, or whatever he was. And eventually, Peter, using his more stronger webs, was able to bind and hold him down long enough. Peter would approach him, asking how he knew his name, and the man would reveal that he would obviously know he was Peter Parker, but who was this other Spider-Man? Since it seemed as though everyone knew what their identities were, Peter and Miles would both take off their masks, and Otto would look very confused. "Neither of you. You're not Peter Parker." "What? Yes, I am. I am Peter Parker." "No, I know Peter Parker. And that's not you." Both Rem and Beatrice would join them. Peter was thankful that Rem had been able to help escort those who might have potentially been hurt off the bridge. Rem's demon strength proving to be rather effective, keeping a few cars from falling off the sides, and Beatrice assisted as well. Now that all four of them had gathered around this strange being, they had no idea who he was or where he had come from. He knew that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, but neither one of these Spider-Men were his Peter Parker. However, their spider sense would go off once again, as another green-like explosion would occur in the distance. The two of them would look up to see something flying towards them. A cackling laugh howling in the air. There was some green-like monster, something akin to that of a demon goblin. A sinister smile on its face, its shining yellow eyes. As it went lunging towards them, Peter and Miles stood at the ready, but before they could even make contact, a portal would open instantly, taking the two of them to an underground location. No one had any idea of where they were. They turned to see wherever that mechanical armed guy had gone, but he wasn't there anymore. As they looked around, they would see that he was trapped in some sort of cage, or a force field cage of some kind. They would turn and Peter would see him. It was Doctor Strange. Kid, a lot's happened, and what the hell? How are you here? Doctor Strange would walk past Miles as he came face to face with Peter. How did you get so young? Doctor Strange. Before any other words could be said, Peter just ran up and gave him a hug. He hadn't seen him in so long that he didn't know if he was ever going to get the chance to. Strange didn't know what was happening either, but he hugged him back. Kid, it's good to see you again, but how did you get here? How did you get so young? It's almost like you're a teenager again. I am a teenager. How old am I supposed to be? Approaching your 30s, well, that was when you died. But you're not from this world, are you? No. But I'm from a world similar to yours. Very similar. Listen, we need to talk. Can you use the void spell? The void spell? Yeah, I know the spell, Peter, but how do you know that spell? Well, the Strange from my world weave. I see. Very well then. Peter would turn back to Rem and Beatrice and Miles. He would tell the three of them that he needed to speak with Doctor Strange about multiversal things. Miles and the others wondered why they had to go speak in private, but Peter would just give them a look. It was a look that explained, I couldn't tell you, but I wish I could. But that you'll just have to trust me. Rem had always trusted Peter, so she understood. Beatrice was a bit more skeptical, and Miles, well, he was confused about everything, but they just chilled in the lower basement of the Sanctum Sanctorum as Peter and Doctor Strange would go inside of the Void. It was a pocket dimension, a world where time and space didn't exist. It was the one place where Peter could speak of return by death and not worry about the consequences. Alright, kid. Whatever you need to tell me, it's gotta be serious if you know about the Void. It is. Look, I think this is a variant of my world. A variant? Yeah, like, in this world, the Peter Parker that died, that's definitely me, just older. From what I've been able to learn, things played out differently in this world compared to my own. Peter would then go on to explain the world that he had come from. A world where him as Spider-Man was a lot more younger. Iron Man played a much more pivotal role in saving the world than they originally thought. However, he would also go on to explain the other situation. The situation of how he was dying during the events of Infinity War. But before his soul could completely be erased, he was transported to the world of ReZero. He would quickly recap all the adventures he had gone through, his meeting with the witches, gaining the witch factor, and getting returned by death. He would tell of its weakness and how, if he spoke it, it would cause his death instantly, and not knowing where his next checkpoint was, that was a risk he didn't want to take. Doctor Strange would be caught up to speed on everything that happened. Although from what he could learn, this variant universe must have been created the moment that Peter did the snap instead of Iron Man. That set a chain of events into motion. Now in the multiverse, it wasn't just that Iron Man would be the only one that could do the snap, but now, if the situation allowed, probably anyone could at this point. Not just he and Tony, maybe Captain America, maybe Hulk, anybody. The ultimate snap that ends up killing Thanos and his army. Depending on who does it, there is no telling how much the world could change. But now that they had caught up to speed on everything else, Peter learned about the spell that happened, what it caused this influx within the multiverse, something of which they knew frighteningly little about. However, Peter became more worried about something else in the meantime. If these various enemies who had fought different Peter Parkers were coming through from different points in time, was there a limit to a number of them that could show up? Doctor Strange would assure him that it was only a small number, and that he had managed to catch one of them roaming around in the sewers, one being known as Kurt Connors, aka the Lizard, but that according to his calculations, there were still a few more out there. Now that they knew what was at stake and they were both on the up and up, they would both agree to keep what needed to be kept on the low, before eventually leaving the void and returning with everyone else. Once gathered together, Doctor Strange would explain the situation at hand. He would show the prism box that contained the spell that went horribly wrong, and Beatrice would inspect it. Dr. Strange now had even more questions, asking who the little girl was that suddenly knew everything about magic, and Beatrice would explain that she was a spirit with over 400 years experience, making Dr. Strange's jaw drop as he realized this young little girl was technically his magical superior in a sense, and the two of them would get to work trying to learn how to undo the spell as best they could. In the meantime, Peter and Miles would turn to the caged prisms, seeing where the one known as Otto Octavius was being held, and also the one known as the Lizard, Kurt Connors. As they spoke, Otto would warn them of the man that they may have to capture, warning that they were flying in the dark blind, and that for all they knew, they were going out there to fight ghosts. Miles and Peter would ask what he meant by that, and he would explain that that man on the glider, the Green Goblin, otherwise known as Norman Osborn, he was from his world, and in his point in time, Norman had been dead. So, either the dead can live again, or they're dealing with ghosts. This made the two of them a bit unnervous. But Peter knew that that couldn't be the case, since in this world he was technically dead, yet he existed. So in the meantime, well, who knows what they were going up against. In the dark streets of New York, there were others who were out there, but two that Peter knew very well. A young woman with dark hair and an elegant, dark purple gown. With her two twin blades, She had gone through the back alleyway of a bar and ran into some rowdy men. They were boisterous and loud and frighteningly terrifying, but their entrails, they were so warm, so pleasing. This one's name was Elsa Grenhart, otherwise known as the Bowlander. The last thing she remembered, she was fighting that spider boy and the one known as Garfield Tinsel. And the next thing she knew, she was here. She had to find him again. Her precious spider. His entrails were what she craved most. And in another part of New York, a man in dark robe, his eyes bloodshot red, his skin a pale green. He bit onto his fingers, his body twisting and contorting, his eyes never blinking, his expression always mortifying. He trembled. He could sense it. The love that he had searched for. It was here. The love had followed him. And now he would go and claim his love. The one known as Betelgeuse was on the prowl for his precious love. As Beatrice would continue her conversations with Dr. Strange, Strange would create a portal allowing for Miles and Peter to go to the Parker residence. As the portal door opened, the Parker family would be sitting in the living room, worried for Miles and his safety and everything that was happening when Peter, Miles, and Rem would walk through. Miles' mother would get off of the couch instantly and rush towards her son, hugging him very close and making sure that he was alright, and everyone else was worried for Miles too. Ned, MJ, Aunt May, even Mayday, but they all turned because they saw someone who they hadn't seen in a long time. Aunt May, she looked as if she had seen a ghost. She was about to fall out of her chair, but she stood up as best she could. As she walked towards Peter, everyone else in the room holding their breath, this couldn't be him, but it looked so much like him. Aunt May would hold him as she asked, Peter? Is that you? It's me, Aunt May. The older woman would burst into tears as she held him close to her. He looked a lot younger, but there was no mistaking this was her Peter. MJ looked as if she wanted to cry as well. Even Ned was starting to tear up a bit as also. This was their Peter Parker, but he was so much younger. How had this happened? They know he died during Endgame, during the final battle. How was he here? There were so many questions, so many things that needed to be answered. They sat him down immediately and just talked to him. Miles and his mother, they sat to the side to watch what was happening, as they too were curious. Although Miles had learned more about what had happened and basically watched as everyone else was caught up on this version of Peter Parker. He explained that he came from a world where he was a lot younger with everyone else when everything that went down. He would try to tell them as much as he could, but there was only so much that he could say. He couldn't bring up return by death. But he would simply mention that he had somehow been sent to another world, and that through certain events, well, things led to being the way that they were. He would also introduce Rem to all of them. Rem being introduced as well. This was, well, if Peter had to put it into words, well, you could say she was his fiancée. Rem would immediately blush hearing this, realizing that she was technically meeting her mother-in-law from another dimension, but still, this was her mother-in-law, and Rem would bow politely and introduce herself. Aunt May thought that she was very cute, and MJ, well, there was some awkward tension about it all. The two women would stare at one another, MJ looking at the young Rem. It was kind of awkward because, well, this was a version of Peter's MJ, but she was a bit older. And in this universe, she married Peter and they had a child together. So to know that there was another version of her Peter that ultimately didn't end up with her, well, she wasn't sure of how to take it. It wasn't anything of jealousy, it was just a bit odd. Of course, Ned was always being Ned. He was just happy to have his friend back, and for him and Peter, it seemed as if no time had passed. They still knew how to finish each other's sentences, and it seemed as if not a day had gone by for either of them. And it was cool to see that his friend could use wind magic now. That was awesome also. But as quick as the reunion had been, there were more pressing matters that needed to be attended to. Such as, well, the villains that somehow made their way to this world. There was a lot that they needed to discuss. Before leaving, Doctor Strange created a wrist gauntlet. He gave it to Peter and Miles, telling them that all they had to do was use it and shoot out a web. Once they did so, it would teleport the villains to one of the cells in the basement of the sanctum. Once they captured everyone, all they would need to do was send them back with no issues at all. For Peter and Miles, this seemed rather simple. Of course, they would have to actually catch these guys, but it wasn't something that would be impossible. At least, they hoped it wouldn't be. But there was one person in the room who had her own conflicting views on the situation, and it was the youngest of them. It was Mayday Parker. She was old enough to know of her father and know of him as Spider-Man. She had seen pictures of him when he was younger, so she knew that this young man had to be her father, but it just felt different. Peter had a bit of a hard time interacting with her, as well as how was he supposed to react to a daughter that he really didn't have a connection to? Although he tried to put up a front for her, not because he didn't care, but because he actually cared a lot. He understood that even if this wasn't his actual daughter, it was still his daughter, and he tried his best to be a good father to her in the short time. MJ and Rem could see this, and for MJ, it reminded her of what she had lost. Not a day goes by when she didn't think of Peter, and in a brief moment, there were days when she would do anything to have him back, and now she had him. She wondered if maybe he could stay. I mean, there was no reason saying they had to leave. I mean, magic existed in this world after all, for Pete's sake. She could lower her age if she needed to make him more comfortable. That didn't really bother her at all. Anything if it meant she could get her Peter back. For Rem, she knew that Peter had attachments to this world, more so than he ever did in Lagunica. What if he wanted to stay? MJ was probably his first love after all. Was she nothing but second best? What right did she have to stand in the way of his happiness? These were the thoughts going through everyone's mind, but Peter and Miles knew they had to get to work. MJ would leave her daughter with Aunt May, and Miles would let them all stay in the house. Ned agreed that he would help them out from here using his computer and using some of his own cellular devices, and MJ would set up a small station where she could help from afar as well, as Pierre and Miles and Rem would go out to do the capturing. The three of them being more than strong and capable of holding their own. They knew that if anyone was capable of finding these villains, they would definitely be able to. Pierre, Miles, and Rem would swing out into the night. As the sun was beginning to set, they had focused their attention on trying to find that goblin guy, wherever he might be. They weren't sure of where to look, but they knew they'd have to run into him eventually. However, they would run into another problem first. As Pierre was holding on to Rem as they were swinging, Miles safely behind them. They were next to some power lines as they could sense something was coming. It had to be an enemy, otherwise their spire sense wouldn't have gone off, but where was he coming from? That was something they didn't really have a clue about. As they waited, they could see sparks of electricity flowing all around them, until eventually, something began to glow. Looking up at the power lines, they would see large golden streaks of lightning, all enveloping into one being, before eventually it looked like a man made of electricity had appeared. It was obvious this was one of the multi-dimensional men that they needed to catch, and Pierre and Miles and Rem would break into formation. Rem would go into her demon Oni form as her horn would begin to grow. Taking out her mace, she would wonder how best to combat the situation. Pierre knew that Rem was good with water magic, so he would tell her to attack from a distance with water. Maybe that could short-circuit him and cause him to run low on juice. Rem would do so, and she would cast a water spell. Creating streams of water, she would try to aim and blast them at the man of electricity as best she could. However, the man would use his speed to block and to dodge them, as Peter and Miles would swing about, moving and encircling him. Peter used some of his wind cannons to try to shoot and take him out, as well as his webbing to try to bind him, although it seemed that he was absorbing more power than what they could deal with. Peter would tell Miles and Rem to buy him some time, while he would begin to charge up as much mana as he could into his fingertips. He knew if he could hit him with a large wind cannon, that should take him out. Instantly though, underneath Miles and Rem, the ground would start to shake and change. This electrical man would shoot a large electric blast at them. Pierre, still charging his mana, knew he couldn't get to the others to protect them in time, but before anything happened, a wall of sand would block the attack instantly. Both Rem and Miles had no idea what was happening here until a face would appear from out of it. The face talking to Miles, calling him Peter and telling him that it was him, Flint Marco. Of course, Miles would have to explain that he wasn't Peter before pointing to another Peter that was off in the distance, and Flint would ask why there were two Spider-Mans, but there was no time for that. They would simply tell him to buy him some cover as they were going to go in for the finishing strike as quickly as possible. Sandman would do so, creating a defensive barrier protecting the two, while they would continue on to attack from a distance. This guy with electrical abilities was slowly starting to take form, eventually gaining back his human body. Once the opening had been created, Pierre would let out a great wind cannon, shooting him in the back and slamming him into the ground. The electricity would slowly take hold of him as he would gain his consciousness, before once again he would become a human. The man, he looked at his hands, he felt his face, he was back. He wasn't blue anymore. he would be ecstatic and feel immensely happy, but he had some other issues right now. Like, first off, he had no clothes. Although thankfully Miles would see a construction suit not too far in the distance and would hand it over to him as quickly as possible. Once he had his clothes on, well, where was he at? How had he gotten this new source of power, and why were there two Spider-Mans? A blue maid girl and a man made out of sand? Well, they had no idea. No one knew. Although, it didn't take too long for him to figure out that this electric guy, he seemed to like the power a bit too much, and Peter and Miles would instantly send him to one of the cells. This caused Sandman to become a bit apprehensive. First and foremost, neither one of these Spider-Mans were his Spider-Man. A running issue that they were running into when it came to these guys, and he had no idea where they had just sent that electric guy, and what if they did the same to him? He just wanted to go back and find his daughter again. He didn't want to be here. And if these guys were going to stop him from doing that, then he had no problem taking them out. However, before the situation could get out of hand, Peter and Miles would send him back as well. The three all gathered together. They would collect their breaths, believing that the worst of it was over, but for Peter, he didn't need spider sense to recognize that smell. He could sense it. He hadn't felt it in so long, but he remembered this presence. Miles would only shake his head in annoyance, wondering who else could possibly be showing up now. But as they looked up into the sky, they would see someone flying towards them. Miles wondered how this guy was able to fly, and why was his body contorting like that, and why was he biting his fingers? But Peter and Rem, they knew who this guy was. The leader of the witch cultists. It was Betelgeuse. Instant bloodlust and rage would start to shoot through Peter. He remembered Betelgeuse. Everything he had done. The witch cultist. If there was one person he didn't feel like showing mercy to, it was him. However, Miles could sense the anger building up inside of Peter, and he warned him to remember what Dr. Strange had told them. They couldn't kill these guys. They had to send them back, or else something worse was going to happen. But Peter, he was barely holding on to that sense of clarity. All he remembered was the death and the carnage. All of it because of this guy. Now granted, he had learned of Betelgeuse's story from Emilia, learning of his tragic fate, and he felt sorry for him, but at the same time, all the horrible things he's done, what he did to Rem in this previous life, there was just this sick sense of animosity that he just couldn't shake off for him. Rem could smell that it was also someone from the witch cultists, and she had a distaste for them as well. Of course, only Peter could see that he was actually riding on the unseen hands. To them it seemed as though he were just flying in midair, but he warned them to stay on guard. As Betelgeuse would descend upon them, he would smile happily. He had found his love. He had now found the one. Oh, how my brain trembles. You've been blessed with her love. Tell me, do you share in the gospel? No, I don't. And you're lucky. Any other day I'd be happy to take you out. But I just gotta send you back. Peter, Rem, and Miles would engage against Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse would use his Earth-style magic to create various mounds of earth walls and attacks to block and hold him at bay. Rem would use her demon-enhanced strength to smash through his defenses. Peter and Miles alerting her with their spider sense respectively whenever an attack that she couldn't see was coming her way. Peter had to focus on offense and defense. Unlike he and Miles, Rem didn't have spire sense, and thus she wouldn't see when any of the unseen hands came towards her. And so he would have to stay close to her to warn her of any other attacks that were coming instantly. Of course, for Peter, if he truly went all out, he could probably kill Betelgeuse, but that wasn't the goal here. Ultimately, they were able to stretch him thin. Once the opening had been created, Peter and Miles would each shoot out one of the magical webs from their gauntlets, hitting Betelgeuse before he could use the unseen hands to block them. He would instantly be teleported away, and now that left another one captured. They weren't sure of how many more were out there other than the goblin, but there couldn't be that many more left. Back at the Parker household, both Ned and MJ had seen what was happening since they had some camera phones strapped to Peter and Miles, so they were able to feed them any information that they needed along the way. Miles' mother would get a chance to see more of her son in action, and she felt proud of him. Despite everything they had been through, the loss of her husband, and Miles' uncle, who didn't live the most straight and narrow of life, her son was indeed a hero. Someone that people should definitely be proud of, and she was proud of him. In the meantime, back within the city of New York, Aunt May, well, she did have other priorities that she needed to take care of, so she went to her local soup kitchen where she helped out those who were in need. It was something that Peter had always known about her. She and Uncle Ben, when he knew them, they were always taking care of others before themselves. It was something that he had always appreciated. The soup kitchen was called the Parker Residence. It was a charity that the Parker family was a part of, and he knew that his aunt and uncle, well, it was something that they were immensely proud of. For Peter, he remembered that day. The day it seemed as though his life came to an end. It was a normal Friday. This was back when Peter had first gotten his abilities, and he wasn't sure of what to do with them. He knew that he could make some serious cash, so he would perform daredevil tricks and different stunts in dangerous locations, going around dressed in a red suit and whatnot and a mask. He would have crowds gather around and record on their video cameras as he would climb to unimaginable heights and jump off and do flips and tricks in the air before falling to the ground with style. Usually the bet was that if he fell and died, the people would be paid, but if he survived, then he would be paid. And for a while, he was known for his tricks and antics all over YouTube as the Amazing Spider-Man. Of course, though, on the night when he was set to perform his greatest stunt, he had, well, a responsibility. The soup kitchen was running an event and they needed help. Peter told his Uncle Ben that he wasn't going to be able to make it because, well, he had to lie. He told him he was going to be at the library and that he had some last-minute exams to study for, and his uncle was understanding. Ultimately, Peter would leave the library and head a few blocks down the road where the stunts were being performed, and the guy who had been working with him to perform the stunt, well, Peter performed it to perfection as he always did, but he got stiffed out of his money. The man promised that he would pay him $3,000, but instead he only gave him $300. And Peter learned that the guy had been skimming money off the top for so long. It pissed him off, but the guy basically told him that if he didn't like it, so be it. And Peter took it to heart. When, as if karma were to hit not a moment later, The guy who had stiffed him for his money, well, he ended up getting robbed. Peter saw the guy running past him down the street, and the man yelled at Peter to stop him, but Peter did nothing about it. The guy yelled at Peter, telling him that he could have done something, and Peter told him that it wasn't his problem. However, that would prove to be the gravest mistake of his life. As once the trick was over and everyone had gone home, well, Peter grabbed his backpack and threw back on his regular clothes. Going to the library to pretend to come outside, he would see a crowd gathered not too far. An ambulance was being called on its way and police had cordoned off everything. Peter wasn't sure of what was happening, but he made his way through and he saw him on the ground. It was his uncle. His uncle had come to pick him up, but Peter had been running late. And the guy that Peter had let go, well, he was looking for a quick getaway and he tried to take Uncle Ben's car. Uncle Ben said no and he was shot in the process. It was this moment that Peter knew all too well. The moment that set him on the path that he was on. There was a slogan, something that had been written on the walls inside of the soup kitchen. It was something the Parker family had always lived by. It was why they volunteered and helped others in need. It was a saying, with great power comes great responsibility. It was something Uncle Ben told Peter time and time again, but he never really listened. Didn't really matter to him that much. And yet those words were the words that were ingrained into his mind and heart. Words that he tried to live by every day. And when he became Spider-Man, he became even more busy and he couldn't help out at the soup kitchen even less than he already was. And so his Aunt May, well, she would run it alone as best she could. And I guess in this universe it was no different, as despite all the craziness around her, well, she still continued to serve at the soup kitchen. It had become a lot more popular since it was basically revealed that she was the aunt to the late Spider-Man who had died in their world. And so more people would help her all the time. As Peter, Miles, and Rem were arriving back to the Parker household, Rem being immensely tired from expending herself a lot helping in the fight, and Miles wanting to rest up a bit as well. Peter would go out when he got a phone call from his aunt. She told him that someone had arrived, someone that he was probably looking for. With no hesitation, Peter rushed to the soup kitchen immediately. He had put on a change of clothes so that no one would recognize him. As he rushed inside, he called out for his Aunt May. Instantly, he would arrive to the back of the kitchen where she would see that his aunt was with someone else, an older man, dressed in tattered clothes of green and purple. Peter could see that it had to be him, the Goblin Man. He told his aunt to be careful, not taking any chances. Peter shot 2 webs, binding his hands to the table immediately. Peter, please, calm down. You don't have to. May, I understand, but I'm not taking any chances with this guy. Now look, I don't know how I got here. Please help. You don't know? I don't know where I am. One minute I'm on a bridge. The next thing I know, I'm here, and where's my son? Where's Harry? Your son, I don't recognize this place. I keep asking, and they say that Oscorp doesn't exist, that I don't exist. I don't know where I am. Peter could see the confusion the hurt on this guy's face, he felt a bit sympathetic. It reminded him of when he had been taken away. His first day in Lagunica, almost as if in the blink of an eye, he was on the planet Titan one minute, the next thing he knows, he's in the middle of a town square with the Opera Man. He understood what it must have felt like to be somewhere where he didn't know anyone or anything. Aunt May could see the hurt on this man's face, and she asked Peter to help him, to try to help the others in any way that they could. And Peter, well, he wasn't sure of what he should do. Should he help them? Could he help them? I mean, could they be rehabilitated? Could anything be done for them at this point? There was no telling. Peter would help Norman to his cell, now being even more conflicted on what he should do. It seemed as though everyone was captured, but there was still one more prison cell left. They didn't know who they were supposed to be looking for. They had been keeping track of the news in case anything had popped up, but nothing had happened so far until there was some breaking news. And the news caught Peter's attention. There were reports of a mass serial killer who had been going around New York, disemboweling its victims, slashing away at their innards and allowing their guts to spill out onto the streets. Hearing that description, Peter knew exactly who it was. He had prayed that she wouldn't have come here, but it couldn't be denied at this point. It was the last villain, the last one that they needed to capture. The others looked to Peter asking what they should do, and Peter told them that he would take care of it. Miles was a bit worried and he wanted to come along as well, and Rem did also, but he wasn't having it. He yelled at the two of them, shocking everyone a bit as they didn't think he'd be so aggressive. Peter apologized, but he made it very clear that he was doing this alone. Rem was very worried about Peter. He looked rather different, but for Peter, he knew what he needed to do. He set back out immediately. He was tired. He was running on fumes at this point, but this was the last one. The last person that needed to be brought down. He swung through the cities, almost as if on instinct. He knew he would find her eventually, and sure enough, he would. In one of the back alleys, among the slums. He would descend as he would stand behind her. Ah, yes. It's you. You found me. Elsa Kreinhardt, the Bow Hunter. And you, the Spider-Man. So, you've come for me at last. Yeah, I have. You gonna come quietly? Or are we gonna do this the hard way, Elsa? I think we both know how this ends. Elsa would take 2 knives from under her cloak and throw them at Peter immediately. Peter would dodge, but in that split second, Elsa would appear right in front of him, slashing away. Peter would just narrowly dodge as the two of them would engage in hand-to-hand combat, Peter grabbing one of the blades and using them himself. He had become a lot more adept at blade arts, and the two of them would show the fruits of their training, as their blades would connect over and over again, the two of them fighting from wall to wall, until eventually they had made their way to the rooftops. They would jump from building to building, fighting and kicking at one another. Peter tried to shoot the teleporting webs, but Elsa had dodged them gracefully. A few times he had managed to hit some of her knives and take them away, but she would take out more and more. He had no idea where she kept them all. the fight would continue on, becoming more and even more aggressive. Peter knew what she was capable of, and he knew better than to underestimate her. As the two continued on in their fight, Peter would take some damage from the attacks, and Elsa could see that she was wearing him down. "You're getting sloppy. This is starting to not be as fun, Peter. Come on, give me a real fight." She would continue to press on the advantage more and more, Peter holding his own as best he could. Eventually, though, they would make their way to an open clearing, where Elsa would go all out. Neither one having a surface to jump on, Peter would wait for the opportune time to take her down. He would let himself be wide open, as she would stab in his shoulder. But that was what he expected, and he could take the pain, because once she had stabbed him, he grabbed her by the wrist and slammed her into the ground, pointing his web shooter directly in her face. He shot it immediately, and she was teleported, as Peter would pull the dagger from out of his shoulder. Pressing the wound, he would go to get it checked and bandaged on as soon as possible. But thankfully, all of the villains had been captured. Peter and Miles would meet back at the basement of the sanctum where they were being kept, along with Rem and Beatrice and Dr. Strange, who had been discussing about various ways to undo everything that had been done. For Peter and Miles, they got a chance to see how the villains interacted with one another. Some came from the same universe and were aware of the others. It seemed as though Otto Octavius, Norman Osborn, and Flint Marko, they came from the same world. As for Kirk Connors and Max Dillon, they came from a similar world also, as they knew each other. And Elsa, well, she was familiar with the witch cultists and with Betelgeuse, but they didn't have that many interactions, and Betelgeuse was practically insane. But now, there came the part of what to do with them. Dr. Strange was preparing to send them back, but there was a bit of an objection. Ultimately, the truth was revealed that the reason why all of these beings were significant was because they all died fighting Spider-Man. All of them slowly coming to that realization. Norman couldn't believe that something like that could happen, but Doc Ock would confirm that he died fighting his Spider-Man. And for Ock, well, he learned he suffered the same fate. Lizard, well, his end was a bit more ambiguous than others. And then there was Electro. The last thing he remembered, well, was he was about to die. For Betelgeuse, he remembered he was fighting in the forest against Peter when a large wind attack came barreling down towards him and slashed him to pieces. And as for Elsa, well, she remembered Garfield and Peter combining to crush her and burn her to ash. It seemed true that they were all destined to die, but for Peter, despite his mixed feelings about them all, it was Norman that stood out to him the most. His situation reminding him of his own, and he just, despite his instincts telling him that it was better if they all just die, he wondered if he should do the right thing. For Miles, he thought about everything else that he had been through. His uncle was a criminal, but in his last moments, he did the right thing. If his uncle wasn't too far from redemption, then could anyone else be? Of course, Doctor Strange had already had it set in his mind to send them back, but Before he could be stopped, Miles would take the first charge. He would snatch the box away with his webs and attempt to escape. Peter, Rem, and Beatrice and Dr. Strange running out to see what was happening, as Strange and Miles would get into a bit of a tussle. Peter wasn't sure of what to do next, but he knew that ultimately you gotta help a spider out in need, so he would unceremoniously join in and help Miles to keep the box away from Dr. Strange. Rem and Beatrice would follow along as well, but what eventually happened was the five falling into the mirror dimension where Dr. Strange held the advantage. Of course, Beatrice was able to see how the mirror dimension worked and was pretty fascinated by it, and Peter and Miles for a while felt as though they wouldn't find a way out. But once they realized how it worked, akinning it to geometry in a sense, breaking it down with numbers and with logic, they were able to come up with a decisive way to hold Doctor Strange and keep him at bay. Peter having the foresight to web away his sling ring to keep him from escaping. Of course, they knew this wouldn't hold him for long, and Beatrice would have a heavy sigh as she looked to her Peter, asking him if he really knew what he was doing. Of course, Peter would nod yes, but again, it was only a guess. Beatrice would then sigh and shake her head, stating that she supposed she could hold him for some time, and that it seemed as though if they needed to use a way to contact them, that object he had, that should do the trick. Of course, Peter was familiar with the sling ring and how it worked, so that shouldn't be too hard for them. And with that, he would find his way out of the mirror dimension and escape, leaving Beatrice alone with Doctor Strange trapped in there. She had tons of more questions, and she wanted to know more about this world and its magic. Of course, Doctor Strange, the last thing he wanted to do was entertain a child about magical things, but given the situation, he really didn't have a choice at the moment. Once Peter, Miles, and Rem arrived back to the sanctum, they would speak to the villains. All 7 of them. They wanted to help them in some way. However, the villains would all debate whether or not if they did or didn't want help. Of course, for many of them, they really didn't feel like they needed to change. But for others, if it meant that they could live and not die and be given a second chance, then they had to take it. And as for Peter, well, he would see Betelgeuse. He would remember hearing about how he had tragically lost his sanity in an attempt to save Amelia's life. If he could save him somehow, maybe he could go back to his own time and help Amelia and save her from whatever caused her torment from the trials in the first place. For Elsa, he didn't understand her much at all. He wasn't sure if there was anything that he could do for her, but maybe there was something he just had to try. Peter and Miles would agree to cure the villains. And for the most part, the villains would agree. But they warned them that if something went wrong, they were going to kill him. The next problem that came through was, how are they going to teleport them away? And how are they going to make sure that they didn't do anything foolish? Peter would give the sling ring to Rem, believing that she was magical enough to learn how to use it, and she became pretty adept. She could open portals, but closing them, that was another story. Although, thankfully, she was able to open a portal and bring Ned and MJ. They informed them of what was happening, and they were on board to help. Miles' mother, someone who had always been keen on watching over her son, she came by as well. Of course, Miles instantly was against the idea, but he couldn't overrule her. She wanted to be more involved in her son's life, and if she could help in any way that she could, well, she was going to do so. So she came along. That left Mayday and Aunt May alone at the house. which would be for the best since that would be the safest place for them. And Ned decided they could come to his apartment. His apartment was rather large, and it had some equipment from his days of working with Peter. There was an old machine in the back that could be used to create any sort of device if they could think it up. It was an old form of Stark tech that had gone out of date, but Peter took it and used it for himself, since he got it from Happy a long while back. The villains were slowly brought in one by one. Lizard was left in a truck on the outside to hide away, and he would simply remark to himself that things weren't going to go the way they planned. Of course, there remained the issue of keeping them in line. Peter would use an extra strong form of his webbing to bind and hold the ones who could become a bit rowdy in place, mainly being Elsa, binding her and keeping her from escaping. As for Betelgeuse, they found a sedative that would keep him in a loopy, fixed state, thus keeping him tamed and stopping him from using his unseen hands. Doc Ock, well, there was no telling of how his arms would react, so Peter and Miles would come up with a bit of a way to keep his arms subdued. They created a device that would drain all of the electrical currency from the arms. They had to help carry them inside of Ned's apartment, but it kept them harmless in the meantime. Norman, he seemed fine, so he was able to walk through, and so was Max. And with that, all the villains, including Sandman, who was still stuck in his sand form and was getting sand all over the place, one by one they worked on cures. Norman helping out as best he could. Miles' mother, having experience as a doctor, she spoke with Elsa one-on-one. She learned about her past, about what she had gone through, and as a woman, they had a bit of a heart-to-heart and could relate on something as touchy as that. Not to justify what she had done, but she understood why she had become the way that she was. Peter, Miles, Ned, and Norman, they would get to work on various cures for the other villains, slowly helping them one by one. First was Otto Octavius. They were able to fix and create a new inhibitor chip for the back, seeing where his mechanical limbs had become intertwined with his spinal cord, and how he had lost control over them. Using the new chip, they were able to restore his control. Now he was the master over the arms, and he truly felt as though he were back. He and Norman having a reunion. As for Betelgeuse, Peter believed that he and Norman suffered from something very similar, and he thought that he could maybe drain the insanity out of them. It was a long shot, but it was one that had to be tried. After the first process was complete, Norman decided that it would be best to work with Betelgeuse since he needed the help more than him. Norman watching on as he would learn more about Betelgeuse's abilities. Of course, Peter in this moment wasn't thinking too clearly. He spoke about the witch factor, or at least as much as he could. He thought that Norman would think he was insane to talk about something like magic, but no. Norman believed that anything could be believable, as long as there was a way to explain it. And well, Peter would explain that the witch factor was an ability that was granted to the user on behalf of a witch. Of course, usually the only way people could steal it was through killing someone else who had the factor, or through some other means, but Peter hadn't discovered any at the moment. And Norman would keep note of this, as he continued on with the cure for Betelgeuse. Eventually, the cure would be made and would be given to him. At first, he seemed as though nothing worked, but slowly, his skin started to change. He went back to his normal stasis. his green beginning to fade, his eyes beginning to shrink, and his pupil starting to return. Eventually, he would slowly regain himself. As he slowly awakened, he would see that the madness, it had been subdued. It had no longer taken over him. He felt as though he were back to normal. He would cry in relief. Betelgeuse felt as though he was himself again. He could go back. He could find Amelia. He could find the others. He needed to help them as quickly as possible, but before he did anything, he turned to Peter and he thanked him. He thanked him for saving him from himself, from the madness deep within, the torment, the voices in his head. He was happy that they were gone. Everything seemed to be going well in the meantime. They were making progress. Electro's cure had been worked on next, and the device to drain away his power was taking effect. Elsa was being counseled more, but she seemed to hold on to some of her murderous tendencies. Maybe a memory wipe? Wiping away her desire to kill might be the best fit. There was work for Sandman, but they still needed to try a few things out, and Otto was now assisting. Miles' mother was happy to see what was happening, filling her with even more pride in her son. Rem was assisting in any way that she could, although she wasn't too keen on the magic stuff, but she was still happy to lend Peter a hand whenever possible. Her and MJ having a few glances with one another from time to time, the tension still being real. All seemed to be going fine until Peter could sense something. He and Miles could sense it both. They felt as if something was happening, but they weren't sure what. Outside of the apartment, J. Jonah Jameson had arrived as well with his camera crew. They had been trailing Miles and Peter, and they learned that this was where they were at. Whoever this other Spider-Man was, who knew? But this new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, well, they were ready to catch him in the act. Peter and Miles' spider sense was still going off. They had no way of knowing what was happening, what was going on around them. But they could sense that there was danger. They eventually turned their eyes back to Norman. Peter instantly shot his web at Norman's hand, sticking him to the wall. It's you, isn't it? That's some sense of yours, Peter. Must say congratulations. Who are you? I'm not that sniveling coward Norman. It's kind of cute. You think you can cure us? You can change and fix us? We don't need to be changed. Look at us. These are not curses. These are gifts. Otto would try to speak sense into Norman, but there was no getting through to him. Norman was no longer in control. You don't have to do this, Norman. Fight it, Peter would say. Fight it? Godspeed, Spider-Man. Instantly, an explosion would go off all around them. This explosion, followed by Norman's words, well, it was more than enough for those who hadn't been changed to want to break free. It didn't help that Lizard had broken out of the van on the outside and was now causing a muck as J. Jonah Jameson and his camera crew caught what was happening. Sandman, deep down, he didn't trust any of this, and he turned into a large storm and left out immediately. Max pulled off the discharger, allowing his powers to roam free. He could feel it, this world, its new power, all of it. He wanted it. And he chose to break free as well. Goblin threw a knife towards Elsa, releasing her from her restraints, and her bloodlust kicked in. Everyone could see that things were breaking down fast. Otto tried to hold down Goblin, but it was no use. Betelgeuse would attempt to fight as well, but Norman was prepared for this. He would set off a concussion bomb around Betelgeuse, creating a loud noise that would be exclusive only to him, causing his eardrums to bleed. From what he had learned from Peter, he knew how the power worked necessarily, and knew that the only way to fight an opponent like this was to disorientate him as quickly as possible. Miles would move to protect his mother as fast as he could, coming into conflict with Elsa, who was just inches away from stabbing her as he kicked her off. Rem would use her demon Oni form, as she would attempt to try to fight back at the others. The lizard would come storming in, and Rem would use her strength to match his, as the demon and the reptile squared off. In the meanwhile, Peter would focus on the goblin. Rushing towards him, he would fire a wind cannon, shooting him through the walls, but it felt as though it did nothing, as Norman was back on his feet in an instant. The two of them engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Peter had become a lot more experienced fighting in Lagunica, going up against various foes that were more so than the goblin, but what the goblin had was pure insanity. The fighting and the chaos would begin to break out all around. Peter, Miles, and Rem, the three of them doing the best they could to protect MJ, Ned, and Miles' mother in the process, as Electro, Sandman, Lizard, Goblin, Elsa, they were all just going off the rails. Otto tried to assist in any way that he could, attempting to chase after one of them who had now gone astray. Peter and the Goblin would continue on fighting in the halls. Despite Peter's enhanced strength, the Goblin seemed to match him in every which way, slamming him down a few floors as they would eventually come crashing in. The building starting to be ravaged and rampaged. J. Jonah Jameson would catch it all in the news, feeling as though he had now finally caught what he had been looking for, catching Spider-Man in the act, exposing him for the menace that he truly was. Betelgeuse would slowly get back on his feet and try to help Peter in the fight. Using his unseen hands, he would attempt to bind and hold Norman at bay, but Norman was prepared. His glider would come flying through in an instant, attacking Betelgeuse from a distance, forcing him to be on the defensive. Norman had thought of his plan rather strategically. Peter and Betelgeuse were holding him off, as Miles would arrive to the lower levels, where Elsa was. Slicing away and attempting to take him out, he had been cut a few times, but he was holding his own. His mother not too far behind, as she wasn't sure where she should go. Ned and MJ attempted to escape also, and Rem was holding her own against the lizard as best she could. The police would be called not too soon after, a SWAT team arriving, preparing to go in and take down everyone. They would begin to fire their bullets into the inside of the first level as explosions and fires started to occur all over. Elsa would see the bullets coming her way, and she would effortlessly dodge them. Now seeing more prey, Miles would rush after, attempting to stop her, as she would go out to confront the police. Moving quicker than they could react, she would start to slash and cut through at them, disemboweling them and spilling their blood all over. Miles tried his best to rein her in, but she continued on as the two of them would battle on the outside. Miles' mother hiding in the distance as Peter and Betelgeuse would continue to fight on against Goblin, while Rem would continue on fighting with the lizard. Eventually it seemed as though all hell was breaking loose on all fronts. There was no telling of what was going to happen. Betelgeuse attempted to protect everyone and moved them out of the way, as Goblin would throw his pumpkin bombs, creating even more explosions and fire. Blinding everyone, he would use another concussive blast, aiming it at Betelgeuse to disorientate him. Just long enough. Peter's spider sense would go off and he would move to avoid an attack. However, in the smoke, he didn't realize that the attack, it wasn't meant for Peter. It was meant for Betelgeuse. He would hear screams as the smoke would clear. Betelgeuse coughing up blood as a blade protruded through his gut. Goblin grabbed onto the blade and held on to Betelgeuse, feeling his power leave him. As the witch factor of sloth slowly began to take over the goblin's eyes, they began to bulge. They began to turn blood red as blood streamed from his eyes. His skin slowly changing until it actually was green. A crippling smile appearing on his face as he could feel it. He could feel the power taking over him. Peter rushed to Betelgeuse's side immediately, trying his best to stop the blood from flowing, trying his best to help him, but there wasn't much that he could do. Goblin would turn back once again, laughing as he looked at Peter. I feel it. I feel it. It's flowing within me. Peter would launch a wind cannon at the goblin, blasting him through a wall. He didn't want to deal with him at the moment. He had to help Betelgeuse. Miles' mother would move in to try to stop the bleeding, but there wasn't much that she could do now. Betelgeuse would simply look at Peter, asking him if Emilia was okay. And with a heavy heart, Peter would tell him that she was doing just fine, that she was safe. This would allow him to smile, now feeling as if, at the very least, what mattered to him was taken care of. Peter would turn back to Rem, rushing towards her. He would help her fight off the lizard as they would drive him back. Elsa, in the midst of the chaos, had escaped, and Miles would try to run back inside as he saw everyone else gathering together. Everyone was converging to meet where Miles' mother and Betelgeuse lay dying, when a pumpkin bomb would be thrown in. Everyone knew what was about to happen instantly. Peter grabbed Rem to shield her from the explosion. Miles tried to push it away, but he ended up being blasted back in the process as the glider went flying through in the room. Miles would rush as he saw his mother being hit by it in the process. She would collapse to the ground, and Miles would go to pick up his mom, making sure she was alright. Peter would rush over to help as well. Rem, seeing what happened to Betelgeuse, the five stood together as the goblin would seemingly rise in thin air before landing on the glider. He turned to face them once again, smiling at them, cackling as he flew off into the eerily night. Miles checked to make sure that his mother was fine and everything seemed okay. He would attempt to help her up on her feet, and she assured him that they were going to get through this. They had been through worse, and they were able to make it by. However, her words would be short-lived as she would quickly fall back to the ground. As Miles looked down, he would see that she had been stabbed. He could see that she was losing a lot of blood quickly, but he couldn't tell. Her adrenaline had been rushing too quickly. She had no way of knowing. Miles would hold on to his mother. He would tell her that he was going to stay with her, that everything was going to be fine. Ned and MJ would get down to the first floor to see what happened. Peter would tell Rem to use the sling ring to get them to safety, and that Peter was going to help them as quickly as possible. Rem was a bit against it, but Peter would just tell her to go, and she would do as she was told. Creating the portal instantly, she would go and leave, heading back to the Parker household with Ned and MJ. As Rem turned to face Peter, they attempted to get up and leave with Miles's mother, but more debris would fall instantly, blocking their path to the portal, cutting off their way of escape. Miles's mother lay dying on the floor. This couldn't be happening again. How could this have happened again? First his father, then his uncle, but now his mom? He couldn't do this anymore. Miles would start to break down in tears as he asked for her to wake up, but she would slowly become more and more unresponsive. The police, more backup had arrived, and they saw the carnage and the chaos. And at the center of it was Spider-Man. Peter told Miles that they needed to go. Miles didn't want to leave at that moment, but Peter knew they didn't have a choice. He grabbed him and web-swinged them away, Miles yelling out in frustration as he and Peter would disappear. The news would capture everything. The sky becoming dark as the rain would begin to fall. Miles would be sitting on a rooftop as he watched a large screen display everything. The death of his mother, the destruction, the carnage, the chaos. All of this. All of it. And it was all because of him. Everything. He felt the weight of the world crashing down on his shoulders. And it felt as though there wasn't anything that he could do at this moment. For Peter, he wasn't sure of what to do either. The one time he tried to do the right thing and this was what happened? No. He was right. There wasn't any point giving these people a second chance. For some it worked, but for others it didn't. What was even the point? He should have just killed them. He should have let them die. If they died fighting Spider-Man, they had it coming. They deserved it. And now look at what he had put Miles through. This wasn't even his world anymore, technically. So why was he fighting so hard for it? The only thing he wanted to do was just go back to Lagunica. This wasn't his fight. He and Miles were both stewing in their own anger. But for Miles, it was his own deep-seated hatred. Meanwhile, back at Aunt May's, the group was worried. Miles and Peter, they were nowhere to be found. They weren't sure of what to do. Rem would use the sling ring, believing that if she could open a portal to where Peter and Miles were, maybe they could find them. Both MJ and Ned and Aunt May, all gathered together, they would look to Rem as she would attempt to use the ring once again. Putting her hands in a circular motion, she would concentrate, remembering to do what Peter had told her. If she focused on a certain person, on a certain place, then it should work. She would focus on Peter. She would focus more on Peter. And eventually a portal would open. Off in the distance, they would see the rain coming down as there appeared to be someone in a Spider-Man suit. They called out to him immediately, and he came rushing towards them. It looked like it was Peter, but as he got closer, they realized that wasn't their Peter, but it was a Spider-Man. This Spider-Man would quickly make his way into the room. Taking off his mask, he was a bit taller, a lot more skinnier, not really bulky, but he was dressed as Spider-Man. As he unmasked himself, this shaggy-haired Spider-Man would look around to see everyone staring at him. "Who are you?" I don't know what just happened, but I know this is going to sound weird, but I'm Spider-Man. Mayday and MJ, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The mother and daughter duo both picking up a dinner roll, they would throw it at that Peter immediately, still being on the defensive. "Why did you throw bread at me?" We wanted to see if you had the tingle. Yeah, I have the tingle, but it's not really for bread. Prove you're who you say you are. I mean, I don't carry ID on me, you know. Kind of defeats the whole secret identity thing. Can you stick to walls? Yeah. This Spider-Man, and for reference to this story, we will be calling him Andrew Spider. Andrew Spider would jump up and stick to the ceiling. Once they saw that he had the abilities of a Spider-Man, Aunt May was a little more confused now than ever before, but she would ask while he was up there if he could take care of a cobweb in the corner they had been trying to get out, and he obliged, doing so. Before jumping back down, he would explain to them that 1 minute he was fighting Electro, and the next thing he knows, he's been in this world and he's been trying to make his way. As he tried to understand what was going on, why were they all gathered here, why was there a blue-haired maid of all things? Like, what was going on? Slowly, he would come to figure out that this was universal dimensional travel. Magic was involved. He wished he had some magic. Well, it seemed that they got a Peter, but it wasn't their Peter, and MJ would simply say, "Try again until we find the right one." Of course, Andrew Spider was a bit hurt by this, but he understood what they meant, and Rem would attempt to do so once again, creating another portal. As she did so, another figure would come walking out. It would be an older gentleman, clean, well-cut, dressed in regular clothing. He would come through and slowly take note of everything that was happening around him, as he introduced himself as Peter Parker. And for the sake of this story, he'll be known as Toby Spider. Toby Spider would make his way inside, greeting them all as their friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He would tell that he had a similar situation and he somehow found himself in this world, and he understood that they had friends who were in trouble at the moment, but as he looked, he saw Andrew Spider. The two of them briefly engaging in a bit of web combat, and Toby Spider getting the best of him on this occasion. They would now realize that more Peter Parkers had somehow arrived to this world. But now, what exactly were they supposed to do in this moment? They knew they had to find their Peter. But before they did anything even further, Aunt May would suggest, why don't you just look for Miles? Hopefully there wouldn't be more than one Miles Morales coming through. And Rem figured that would be a good idea. The other Spider-Men could sense that something had happened. They could feel it. There was a great disturbance, if you will. Rem would calmly open another portal once again. She still didn't know how to close these things, but they eventually closed on their own. And finally, they would find the rooftop where Peter and Miles were, the both of them looking disheveled, unsure of what to do. The two Peters, along with MJ and Ned and Aunt May and Mayday, they would all come out. Seeing the two of them, they would rush and give them hugs respectively. Aunt May and MJ and Ned moving over to Miles, they had seen what happened on the news. They knew what he was going through at this moment, and they were there for him. And for Peter, well, Rem went to check and see if he was alright, and he told her that he was doing okay. The two other Spider-Men would join as well, introducing themselves. They would be caught up to speed on what had happened, and they would try to figure out what to do, but for Miles, he was done. He didn't care. Aunt May would try to speak some sense into him, but he would snap. Miles, I'm so sorry. I know what happened, and trust me, we all feel... You don't do that. No, all of this is insane. Me trying to be Spider-Man, huh? Me trying to live up to their legacy? I can't do it. I can't. I'm not Peter. I'm not Spider-Man. I can't save the damn universe. I can't do anything right. Miles, it's okay. It's not okay. It will never be okay. Don't tell me it's okay. And you, don't act like you know what I'm going through. You don't. Miles wanted to give up. What other reason did he have to keep fighting at this point? Being involved in this, he got his father killed. His uncle died trying to protect him, and now his mother. What more? How much more loss did he have to take? Rem would look to Peter, and she tried to tell him to help, but he didn't say anything. Rem would ask Peter what was wrong, but he said nothing again, only saying that maybe Miles was right. Rem would look at him, completely in shock. Peter, you can't, Rem. Maybe it's for the best that we just don't get involved, okay? But Peter, how can you say... Rem, come on. I'm not from this world. This isn't my world. This isn't even my fight. What am I supposed to do? My only focus is making sure that we can get back home. But Peter, you can't just abandon them. Why not? What's the point? What am I supposed to do here? You're just gonna give up? Is that it? Well, if you have a better idea, Rem, I'd love to hear it. Just leave me alone. Peter would go off to be on his own. Rem, being upset, would do the same. And Miles, he and Peter, they just felt lost this time. Both Toby and Andrew Peter, they would take the other two and ask for a bit of privacy. The four all convening together. The four Spider-Men. They would each talk about their losses, about the struggles that they had gone through. For Toby, it was the loss of his Uncle Ben. The feeling of guilt that he had never gotten over. For Andrew, it was about the loss of the love that he had. A girl that meant everything to him, Gwen. She died in his arms. Then there was Peter from the world of ReZero. He didn't say much. He wanted to, but how could he? But the other Peters could look into his eyes and they could sense it. They could see that he had been through something But whatever it was, he couldn't say it. And for Miles, it was his mother. They would all think of everything they had been through, their losses and the struggles that they had to overcome them. But despite everything, they always remembered that with their power came the responsibility to do what was right, to stand steadfast and be strong in the face of adversity. As Peter heard these words, he continued to think to himself. He thought of time and time again, every fight, every death, every restart. He would try to speak up. He wanted to tell them of everything that he had been through as well, but he wasn't sure how to share it. The other Peters would look as they heard him speak, and he would try to tell them of a return by death, but instantly time would stop. A dark void would form all around them. Peter could feel a pain coming up in his chest, but it wasn't like before. He didn't know if he was about to die now. Maybe he was. Maybe a do-over was what they needed. Now, Peter. Don't think that dying will so easily fix things. That voice. Echidna? Peter would find himself in the plain, in the witch's domain, as he would see on the hillside Echidna would be smiling. She had a larger table with a larger umbrella and with 4 cups for tea. Well, Peter, it seems you finally returned, and you've brought some friends. Wait, friend? What the Peter turned and saw that the other 2 Peters were with him. They were fully conscious of what was happening, and they had no idea how they had gotten here. Andrew Peter was a lot more intrigued than Toby was. Dude, did we just get isekai'd? You mean sent somewhere else? Yeah, I think so. This is crazy. I've never gotten to be involved with magic. Echidna? What's going on? Why are they here? It's just me. You're right. It is just you. Another you, and another you. Oh no. Guys, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for you guys to get caught up in this, Peter. It's okay. You're us, we're you, so your problems are our problems, but what's going on here? The 3 Spider-Men would all sit at the table as Peter would cautiously explain to them the truth. The others couldn't possibly believe that this was happening. How did a version of themselves get caught up in something like this, of all things? Being teleported to another world, fighting aliens to fighting monsters and demons and all this other stuff. Of course, Andrew Peter was hooked on every word. The idea of being sent to another world, of learning how to do magic. This Peter could do magic. He couldn't do magic. He wished he could do something. Echidna was really intrigued with the other Peters, though, to learn more about them, to learn what made them alike and what made them different. Peter, in the meantime, wasn't in the mood for this. He had a real problem on his hands. He would ask her if he used return by death, where would his start point be? Echidna would warn him that that information would cost him a heavy price, and he might not like the answer. The other Peters could sense what he was about to do, and they would immediately stop him. They would tell him that trying to just kill himself off and start over again, that wasn't the way. Of course, for Peter, he didn't like the idea of just ending it all either, but what was other choice that they could do? Well, first they would warn he didn't know where he would be starting at. For all he knew, he could probably just go back to right after everything had happened. And if he started over, what if he left the world that he had been in to begin with? He would basically just be getting a do-over for nothing, and not much would change. And they would still be stuck in the same situation. He may not have liked it, but they couldn't just try to get an instant do-over from their problems. They had to be able to push forward and work together. Peter knew that that was the right answer, but all the same, it just felt as if it were too much for him. The other Peters now knew what their counterpart had been going through, and they understood. They understood that he had been holding in a lot. To be in another world, to have to start over basically from zero. And what's worse, this world was probably the closest to his original, and there was no telling if he was ever going to get back. But they would tell him that no matter what, he wasn't alone in this. They were going to work with him. If all four of them stood together, they could get through this. They would find a way. Peter would agree, and he would turn back to Echidna, and he would ask her something else. He would ask her how to stop the goblin. She would tell him that for that, she wanted something in return. Peter asked her what her price was, and she told him she wanted to share in their lives. She wanted to be able to see into their past, to see their futures. She wanted to see it all for her own eyes. The other Spider-Men, they weren't sure, but they knew that no matter what, nothing she did would work. Although Andrew was a bit afraid. Andrew Spider being afraid of, well, making a deal with a witch. And the Echidna could sense this fear, and she told him he was justified. After all, she was a witch. But they all stood in their resolve and agreed. And as proof of their payment, they would each hand over their mask. It would only be in a spiritual sense. They would still have their mask when they returned back to their world. This would just be a sign or proof. Peter understood what she meant by this, and he told them they would still have their mask. But now Echidna had all three masks of the Spider-Men laid out in front of her, looking distinctly at the eyes. She was immensely pleased, and she would slide a gospel over to Peter, telling him that this would help him with Elsa and with the goblin. What he did with it after that, well, that was up to him. Peter would nod, and the three Spider-Men would prepare to leave, but before doing so, Andrew and Peter Spider, along with Toby Spider, they would all go back and take a sip of the tea Echidna had made for them. Unfortunately, Peter would quickly realize what the tea was, and he spat out immediately, and he tried to warn the others not to do it, but they had already downed the whole cup. Andrew Spider stating that it tasted a bit funny. Toby Spider asked why he tried to stop them from taking the tea, and Echidna would simply smile. Peter would simply warn them that it was best if they didn't know, and they immediately were sent back to the world of which they had left. No time had passed, so what was a conversation for them was but a brief second in the regular world. With Miles now standing with them, he asked if they were all right, and they assured him that they were fine. But now they had to get to work. They had to figure out a way to cure their respective villains. Andrew Spider, he had dealt with the lizard before, so he could do it again. And for Max, he was sure that they could figure out a way to take that power. Toby Spider would get to work on a cure for Flint Marco, aka Sandman. And Peter would begin reading through the Gospel. He understood its context, and He would have to find the answers for Goblin and for Elsa within them. But before he did, there was something else that he needed to do. While Miles was assisting with finding a way to cure Electro with Andrew Spider, the two of them working together, and with Ned and MJ assisting in any way that they could, Peter would go to the rooftops where he would see Rem all alone. He knew he needed to talk to Rem and smooth things over, but he only hoped that she wouldn't be too mad at him. Peter would walk up to Rem as she turned around to face him. The two of them looking at one another, they knew that there was a lot of tension between them and a lot that they needed to discuss. Rem, do you want to stay here? What? Do you want to stay here? I mean, it may not be the exact world, but you know it better than I do. You have people here that you actually know and care about. I'm sure if you figured out a way, we could go back home and you could stay here. Rem, what are you talking about? I'm not going to... But Peter, come on. Let's be honest, I'm not her. She was your first love. What was I? Just your second choice? Rem, don't say that. I love you with all of my heart. I wouldn't want to change that for anyone or for anything. Really, Peter? You have a daughter with her. That's another version of me, but it was still you. That you can't deny that you don't feel anything for them? Can you just so easily leave them behind? Is it really just that easy for you to just start over again? Rem, it's not. Trust me, the last thing on earth is easy for me to start over. That would be the hardest part. When I came to Lagunica, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where I was going. I met you, Amelia, Puck, Beatrice, Roswell. I've met you all along the way. And I don't regret any of that for one moment. Look, I don't know if I'll ever come back to the world I used to be in. But I've made peace with my decisions. Peter would walk close as Rem tried to pull away, but he pulled her closer back towards him, looking into her deep blue eyes. Rem, I love you. And when this is over, we are going back home together. No exceptions. Rem and Peter looked into one another in a brief moment as they would share a kiss. The other Spider-Men knew what was happening from a distance, and they could see the look on Andrew Spider's face. Toby Spider patted him on the shoulder and told him that everything was going to be alright, knowing that he had experienced his loss. He couldn't help but picture himself and Gwen and the two of them. Of course, he had wanted to be like that, but his life as Spider-Man, well, didn't really allow for Peter Parker to exist. But Toby Spider told him that you eventually find a way. As for Miles, well, he didn't really have much in terms of love life, but it was pretty cool. In the meantime, all four of the Spider-Men would get to work on the cures for their respective villains, believing that this was going to work. Finally, Peter would send out a video message. It would be viral for all of the world to see. He knew that the villains would have to hear them at some point. They were looking for the box, the one thing that could put an end to their reign, and he had it. He told them that if they wanted it, they could come find them up at the Statue of Liberty. With that, the other Spider-Men would go and make their preparations. all four of them getting suited up for a fight. Rem would be prepared as she would come along with them. MJ, Ned, and Aunt May, they would be on standby in case they needed anything. Before leaving, MJ would tell the younger Peter that she used to know to be safe. And he promised her he was going to be fine. And she would look to Rem and tell her to look after him. And Rem would nod that she would do so. As the five would make their way to the Statue of Liberty and wait for the villains to arrive, the four Spider-Men would engage in a nice conversation talking about their own issues, their own struggles with being Spider-Man. The one thing that shocked them all was they learned that Tobey Spider, well, he could make his own webbing, making the other Spider-Men immensely jealous to see that he could do something that they wished they could do. But each Spider-Man had their own difference. For one, Andrew Spider, well, he fought some villains. A Russian mobster in a rhino mechanized suit. Both Tobey Peter and Re-Zero Peter, well, they had fought aliens. Andrew Spider wanted to fight an alien. Well, Miles had fought an alien also. He fought a version of Thanos. Peter had killed Thanos. Tobey Spider, well, he fought a black symbiotic alien from space. They all discussed their different abilities as well. Re-Zero Peter could use wind magic of all things. Miles could use camouflage and could use an electric discharge, making the others feel immensely jealous. Andrew started to feel a bit down on himself. He openly acknowledged that he was probably the lamest of all of them, but everyone would gather around him immediately and tell him that that wasn't true, and that he shouldn't speak negatively about that. No, be more confident. He was a Spider-Man like the rest of them, and Spider-Man stuck together. All four of them holding on and embracing one another in a group hug, a huddle before the battle. Rem looked on at the four of them. It was as if she were looking at four brothers, bonding and getting along, and it made her happy. However, the reunion would be short-lived, as a large torrent of sand would begin. As the villains were now all converging, Elsa had now gotten a hold of her blades, and she was ready for round 3. Electro had arrived along with Lizard and Sandman. All four. The four villains and the four Spider-Men. Each one would pick a target as the battle would begin. Tobey Peter would try to speak sense to Flint Marko, but he wasn't really getting through to him. Lizard was focused on Andrew Spider, trying his best to carve away at him, while he would try to speak sense to Dr. Connors. Electro would come face to face with Miles. Electro actually lamenting that it was pretty dope to see a black Spider-Man, to see someone like him doing good, but he won't like that. And the two of them would engage in their fight, but Miles's Venom Touch was able to stun Electro a few times, but it didn't anything more but charge him up even further. And as for Re-Zero Peter, he and Rem would turn their attention to Elsa, the Battle Hunter, as she effortlessly maneuvered through the scaffolding, attacking the two. Rem would use her mace to create distance between her and Elsa, using her weapon to block away at the blades, while Peter would try to bind and hold her in place. He had read through the gospel, and he knew what he needed to do, but he needed some time to get the spell into motion. He wasn't sure if he would cast it well, or if it would work at all, but he knew he had to do something. The Spider-Men all tried to take on the villains, but they were being clumsily at best, mixing around and not getting the cures that they needed on time. All of them as if they were stumbling in the dark. Rem, in the meantime, was not only helping Peter fight, but she had taken to guarding the box and keeping it secure. The Spider-Men knew that they needed to regroup, and after fumbling around for a bit, they would all eventually gather together once again, each one speaking of what they did wrong and what they did right, but ReZero Peter tried to get them all to focus. He would ask them if they had worked with the Avengers before. Of course, he and Miles had, but the other two, they didn't have the Avengers in their world. They knew that the answer was teamwork. They had to work together, to watch each other's backs, and that if they stood as one, they could win this. Rem would take the box, telling them that she was going to secure it and keep it safe. Opening a portal, she would work to get to safety as quickly as possible. Peter and Rem both looking at one another, each one saying, "I love you," as Rem would tell Peter to go. ReZero Peter and the others would all don their masks once again, as the four jumped out, swinging alongside the Statue of Liberty. All four of them united as one, as the villains had rejoined together. The two sides sizing each other up as they engaged in the second wave. Each Peter worked to take out the villains one by one. The first was Sandman. Once luring him to a secure location, Toby Spider would use his device to take away the sand and its abilities, turning Flint Marko back into a human. Andrew Spider-Man would get to work next. Focusing on the Lizard, he was able to get him close enough to the cure, the anti-serum that would take away his lizard-like abilities and turn him back into a human. Electro was a bit difficult to deal with. His electrical powers were at the highest they had ever been, and getting close to him was rather difficult. Eventually, though, another would appear on the battlefield, that being none other than Doc Ock. For a while, the four Spider-Men seemed a bit worried, as he grabbed Toby Spider and Andrew Spider by the throat, ReZero Spider wondering if the chip didn't work. Electro got closer, telling him that he didn't need help and that he could take them all out alone. But when he wasn't looking, Ock would grab him easily, using the device to help drain away and siphon all of his power once and for all. Miles would catch him and swing him onto the ground, as Ock would let go of the other Spider-Men now that the ruse was over, before telling them that they had done a good job, as Toby Spider and his Otto Octavius got to meet for the first time in a long time, happy to see one another. Otto asked how he had been doing, and his Spider-Man told him he was doing better each day. Finally, there was Elsa, the bounty hunter. Peter knew the spell and recognized it. He had to get close enough to her. As he jumped, he let himself be opened, and Elsa would go in for the strike. She would stab him, but Peter would catch the blade in the palm of his hand, holding it, as he held her to the ground. Elsa looked at him, her face thriving. She knew that this would probably be the end of her. She would open her mouth as her razor-sharp teeth would bite on Peter's neck, and Peter would yell out in pain, but he would perform the spell verbally, and eventually, both of their minds would become connected. This spell was one that was a lot more complicated. But Peter felt that it would work best, especially since he had seen the movie Inception before. Deep within Elsa's mind, we arrive to a cold and wintry night in the streets of the Holy Land. A young Elsa, in tattered clothing, with no home, hadn't eaten in days. She was starving. She was immensely hungry. She would do anything for food. On this night, she would attempt to break into a bakery. All she wanted was a piece of bread. Even a stale crumb would be more than enough to suffice. However, the owner would catch her. The owner being an older man who saw a feeble young girl, and he attempted to do something that he shouldn't have towards her. It was this moment when she acted in self-defense, being bathed in the warmth of his blood. That warmth was all she had ever known. It's what drove her to being who she was. Once realizing this, Peter knew what he needed to do. Now deep within the recesses of her mind, the young Elsa was being cornered by the shopkeeper once again, as he prepared to force himself upon her. But before he could, Peter would swing in instantly, grabbing the older man and beating him down into a pulp. He was absolutely disgusted at what he tried to do. To see what she had gone through, to now understand her. Not that it made what she had done right, but he understood. He would pick up the young girl as he could see she was afraid. She would pick up a broken piece of glass and try to cut him, but Peter would catch her hand and stop her. Instead, he would pull her into a hug. The young girl being terrified, she wasn't sure what to happen. But Peter would take off his mask. As he wrapped her in his cloak, he would tell her everything was going to be fine. Everything was going to be okay. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. She would always be safe. He held her close, and the young girl would shed tears of relief as Peter would take her away to safety. From this point, her memories would begin to change, as a new life had been formed for her. Eventually, they would reawaken back to the world of which they were in. The bloodlust in Elsa's eyes would dissipate as she would look up and she would see Peter once again. She would begin to cry as she now recognized him, not as her enemy, but as the man who had saved her. She reached out and hugged him, happy to see that he was all right, letting go of her blades. And with that, Elsa was now cured as well. Once the fight was over, Peter would call for Rem, asking her to use the sling ring to open to where Beatrice and Dr. Strange were. She would focus and do so. As the portal opened, Beatrice would be sitting, continuing to talk to Dr. Strange, who had now grown deathly annoyed. He had spent over 12 hours talking about magic. I mean, sure, it was fine in spades, but for 12 hours, and the girl had so much information. He got free instantly and snatched back the box and the sling ring from Rem. He was about to chew them all out, but he turned and he saw that the villains had been cured. I guess they really could make a difference, huh? All seemed well until a cackling would come behind them, descending upon them in his broken and battered green armor. His green skin now being completely exposed, Norman Osborn, his bloodshot eyes as he yelled out for Spider-Man to come out to play. He would reach for the box Using his abilities with the unseen hands, he would snatch it away instantly, the other Spider-Men desperately chasing after him. They would eventually grab it back, but as they got it to Strange would attempt to use the device to send them back once and for all. However, as he was about to do so, he would see a pumpkin bomb had been placed inside. An explosion would occur, a massive one shooting everyone back in different directions. Rem had fallen off the side and there was nothing for her to hold on to. As she would begin to fall at almost 300 feet, her Peter would lunge towards her to try to grab her as quickly as he could, but before he could even reach out, Goblin came through using his unseen hands once again, pulling him by the leg and throwing him out. Peter yelled out for Rem, knowing that he had to get back to her as fast as possible, but he had been held up by the Goblin. Although, she would be caught, as Andrew Spider would swing down and grab Rem immediately, saving her before they hit the ground. Rem could see that it meant a lot to him, and she would ask if he was okay. He tried to hold back his own tears as he told her he was fine. In a sense, this was his closure, in a way. In the meantime, the box had been destroyed and the spell, it was starting to take effect. Beatrice, now with everything she had learned, would help Dr. Strange hold it back, a lot better than if he were doing it alone. But for how long they could hold it, they didn't know. Once Rem was secured, the 4 Spider-Men would all gather together on the broken platform. Seeing the Goblin hovering above them, they could all use their spider sense to tell where the unseen hands were, but Peter could see them directly. As they all looked up towards him, each one had their own vendetta against the Goblin. For Toby, this was his Goblin personally, the one that tormented his Aunt May, the one who tried to kill Mary Jane, who had caused so much pain. His hatred began to boil. For Andrew, he lost his Gwen because of the Goblin. For Miles, his mother. And for Peter, his chance to save Betelgeuse had been taken away because of him. All 4 of them had their own vendettas against the Goblin, and he couldn't help but laugh. No matter what the spider, you always fall to the Goblin. Now, let's talk. The Goblin would descend upon them on the glider. Using his unseen hands, he would attempt to fight all 4 of them off. The Spider-Men, using their spider sense, they were able to dodge effortlessly. But still, the Goblin proved to be rather effective with his abilities. Using the extra hands, he would throw out pumpkin bombs and bat bombs any way that he could, attempting to take him out as quickly as possible. The 4 Spider-Men would work to subdue him. Each one working together, they would attempt to hold him down long enough for Peter to use the spell. He told them that he had to do so. It was the only way that he could stop him once and for all. Once the opening was created, ReZero Peter would get in front of the Goblin as he would announce the second spell. Once he did so, they would find themselves trapped within a dark void. It would only be him and the Goblin, but he could see it as clear as day. Each one could see inside of the other. They could see the force within. They could see that the other had a witch factor. And now in this plane of existence, it was a matter of who could steal one from the other. Peter would get close to the Goblin and the 2 of them would engage in hand-to-hand combat. Each one using everything they had learned, all of their experience, everything they could muster up into this fight. Despite the goblin's best efforts, Peter would ultimately come out on top, claiming the witch factor for himself. He would steal the unseen hands and strip him away. Upon doing so, they would break free from the realm, back into reality. The goblin's skin would slowly start to change from its ghastly green back to its normal color. However, the influence of the goblin still remained. Peter felt very tired. It took a lot out of him to use it. He knew his gate was all but destroyed at this point, and Beatrice and Amelia were going to chew him out when he got back home. He couldn't dare muster up any more magic at this point. He had used almost all of his mana. While he was recovering, the other Spider-Men taking a chance to catch their breath. That only left Miles all alone with the goblin. The goblin, tired, drained, and beaten, he continued to mock Miles for the death of his mother, and Miles slowly started to give in to the rage. As he engaged with the goblin, he began to beat on him. This wasn't a fight for survival, no. Miles was out for blood. As he began to beat on the goblin over and over again, the goblin knowing that he was going to make him give in and kill him. Miles eventually beat him until he couldn't move any further. He picked up the broken glider. He was ready to stab him through the chest and be done with him. But before he could, Toby, the Toby spider, would stop him. As ReZero Peter would yell out for Miles not to give in to the anger, not to give in to the hatred. It stopped Miles from his bloodlust from the moment. But in that brief second, the goblin, in his final desperation, would stab Toby Peter through the back. The others looking on mortified. Andrew would throw the cure from Miles, and Miles would stab it into the goblin's neck, freeing him of the goblin's influence. As Miles went to check on Toby's spider immediately, Andrew joined him, followed by the ReZero spider as well as Rem, who would begin to use her healing magic to best help and treat his wound. Thankfully, it wasn't anything life-threatening, but she could still feel that he was in pain. But thankfully, he would survive. With the villains now cured, it seemed as though all was well. However, the final obstacle remained in front of them, undoing the spell that had been caused. The multiverse was starting to collapse. Beatrice was a great help, but in the end it was more than even the two of them could bear. They were starting to come through, and he couldn't stop them. Miles would go to Doctor Strange asking what they could do now. They couldn't perform another spell. There wasn't anything that they could do at this point. But Miles, after thinking about it for a while, he asked if he could just make everyone forget. If he could make everyone forget that he was Spider-Man. Or just make them forget that he existed. Something that extreme, it could work, but Beatrice would warn him. If he did something like that, everyone was going to forget he existed, including the Parkers. Miles would look back at the other Spider-Men. He would look back at all of the destruction and everything that happened up until now, and after thinking, he was okay with the choice. Strange, he felt bad. He saw the young Peter that he had once known, and now the one who had inherited his legacy. He knew that he would be on his own now, and he told him he was sorry, telling him to take care of himself. Miles would not, as he went back and joined the others. Beatrice would help with Dr. Strange, as they would work on the spell to make everyone forget who Miles was. Thankfully, being a spirit herself, this wouldn't affect Beatrice at all, but she knew it would affect Dr. Strange. And despite the fact that Strange wasn't going to remember any of this, he would thank Beatrice for her assistance, and that hopefully they would see each other again. There was a lot more magic to be discussed, and Beatrice agreed. She wished she could have learned more about the Sanctum Sanctorum. They had so many amazing books. It was a really fun time, but she supposed that it was time for them all to say their goodbyes and go home. Beatrice would create a portal, allowing for Peter and for Miles to go and speak to the Parkers one last time. But before the Spider-Men would leave, they would turn back to Toby and Andrew Peter. All four Spider-Men gathered together. They would thank each other immensely for their help. As they shared in one final hug, they would wave to them as they left through the portal. Rem, along with her, Peter, and Miles. They would arrive to the Parker home where everyone else was, and Miles would tell them of what was about to happen. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. They didn't want to forget Miles. He had become like family to them. They didn't want him to go. Miles would assure them that he would find them again, he promised. And they would make him promise. They also knew now that their Peter, he was about to go back home. They would each give him a hug, immensely happy that they got to see him again. That this was the gift that they had wanted for so long. Rem would watch on as Peter would say his goodbyes to Ned, to MJ, to Mayday, and to Aunt May. As Aunt May would pull Rem, she would give her and Peter both a hug, giving them her blessing and telling Peter to make Rem happy. The two of them would hold hands, and he promised to do so. As a light would slowly envelop the two of them, they would begin to fade. As they smiled and waved back, Peter saying goodbye for what might be the final time. Miles looking on happily as he could see the world was starting to be set back. He would leave immediately, knowing that this was effectively the end for them. But before leaving, Aunt May, in the last moments, she had something she wanted to give him. She would look through and she would find the box. They were the box that held their Peter's first web shooters. She would make him promise to take good care of them, and he promised to do so, holding on to the box as he would swing away. Eventually, time would pass. Miles would visit the grave of his mother, who would be buried next to his father and his uncle. He would tell them that things were going well, although starting over from zero wasn't really what he was expecting, but he knew that he could endure it no matter what. He moved into his own apartment. He was starting over now, so he was completely on his own. As he shut the door, he realized that there was something a bit off about it, but he would talk to the landlord later. As he looked on his TV, he would see the Parker family gathered together. They were speaking at the memorial, the anniversary of Peter Parker's death, the Spider-Man who saved the world. They were asked questions about the new Spider-Man. They didn't know much about him, but they only hoped that he would live up to the legacy of Peter. And Miles, as he looked to a chest that he had been carrying, he donned the suit that he had made, an updated one. He felt as though this were a new start for him. As his phone would go off, the local police scanner telling of a bank robbery in progress, Miles would suit up as he would swing out into the cold Christmas night, set out to protect the world as Spider-Man. In the meantime, Peter, Rem, and Beatrice, they would arrive back at Oswald's mansion. For them, it was as if time had never faded away at all. Of course, Peter would try to tell them of what had happened, and Beatrice and Rem would corroborate his story, but Rom couldn't believe it very much. Garfield thought that they had lost their minds, and Subaru and Amelia, well, they were fascinated and they wanted to know more, learning about all of these different Spider-Mans apparently. Oswald, however, he was listening very attentively, as this could be the key to potentially getting back to Echidna. And he continued to keep his eye on Peter. Not too long, a small wedding would be held. Close friends and family would all be gathered together at Oswald's mansion, as the wedding between Peter and Rem would be held. The two of them exchanging their vows, both promising a long and happy life together, as everyone celebrated Mr. and Mrs. Parker. And finally, sitting in her chair, the witch of greed, Echidna. She sipped her tea as she looked up above. In the corner of the umbrella, there was a large spider web. Of course, to anyone, this would be nothing but an ordinary web, but no, this web was something special. For within the web, within each pattern, she saw a different world, a different possibility. A Spider-Man from the 1960s, a Spider-Man who was friends with some man of ice and a girl of fire, a Spider-Man from the 90s, a Spider-Man from another country, Japan. Isn't that Subaru guy from Japan? A Spider-Man that had gone into the future. The Tobey Spider-Man verse. The Andrew Spider-Man verse. The original MCU. The world of the Spectacular Spider-Man. The world of the Ultimate Spider-Man. The world of Into the Spider-Verse. The new timeline, the unseen timeline. The world of Spider-Noir. The world of Penny Parker. The world of even Spider-Ham. She saw all of these possibilities. What she had gotten in return for her services was a one-way mirror to see all of the Spider-Verse, to learn of all of the different possibilities, to see where all of the Parkers could ultimately wind up. And she was more than happy with what she had gotten. She made sure that she had an extra pot of tea, because now she had a lot to watch. This concludes What if Spider-Man wasn't ReZero, the Princess and the Spider, the movie, No Way Home? Thank you to everyone who has supported PowerCore Productions and Podcastings and for enjoying this series. As always, I cannot do it without you. You make the channel grow, you make the core grow. If you like what you see in PowerCore Productions, then please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and hit that bell for post notifications so you can stay up to date on everything that is PowerCore Productions and Podcastings that has to come out now and in the future. But without further ado, we're going to bring it into today's video. So, I'm Javon Harrington with PowerCore Productions and Podcastings, signing off, and I'll see you next time.